Tonight we're talking about impaired driving and the law. Of course, impaired driving has a huge impact on our society. Driving under the influence of alcohol has a range of penalties not just for the driver, but for their friends, families, and victims. Welcome to Lawyers on the Line. I'm Stephanie Balmer, a partner with the Falsani, Balmer, Peterson Quinn law firm, and this evening's moderator. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Jim Balmer of the Falsani, Balmer, Peterson Quinn law firm, Nora Sandstad, Assistant St. Louis County Attorney, and Vicky Wanta, Assistant St. Louis County Attorney. We're ready for your questions. Call the numbers at the bottom of the screen, 218-788-2844, or toll free at 1-877-307-8762. And now, on to tonight's topic, which again is impaired driving. Dad, what is your involvement with impaired driving from the civil standpoint?
Well, as you know, I do only civil law, which means non-criminal. And I seek compensation for people who have been harmed by the wrongful acts of others in court. Some people call me a personal injury lawyer. In the civil area, impaired driving comes up when somebody has had too much to drink and hurts someone with their car, or gets in an altercation with them, either in a bar or a restaurant or someplace like that, or is texting on their phone instead of watching where they're driving, or even talking on a cell phone instead of watching where they're driving. So those are the kinds of impaired driving that lawyers in my field encounter routinely. And if it causes injury or death, then we have a claim against the driver who was impaired.
Okay. Nora, what is your involvement with impaired driving?
So my work for the county attorney is on the civil side as well, and it involves civil forfeiture of vehicles in driving situations. And so what happens is when the prosecutors, like Vicky Wanta next to me here, charge somebody with driving under the influence, if they're convicted of a certain higher level of DUI, then the legislature has decided that the law enforcement and prosecution working together can seize the vehicle and take the vehicle, this tool of the crime, out of the hands of the offender.
Okay. And Vicky, Nora just mentioned a little bit about what you do, but how is your work involved with impaired driving?
Well, I do the adult prosecution for the county, and part of that includes DWIs. So we handle, once we get police reports regarding the charge, we end up charging them with a DWI if it's appropriate, and it all depends on what level it is, but that's when Nora's part comes in. But we deal with the criminal aspect of it and what the consequence should be as far as possible jail time, prison time, treatment options, things like that.
Okay. Dad, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what some of the penalties can be in the civil arena. Vicky just mentioned, sentencing is an issue on her end of things, but what can someone who has been driving under the influence of alcohol or engaged in one of these dangerous practices that you just mentioned receive as far as a penalty?
The first thing to understand is that if somebody is driving carelessly and they harm someone, then they are legally responsible to compensate the person they harmed for the injuries. Most of us have insurance to cover that. So if I drive carelessly and I harm somebody, say hit a pedestrian crossing the street, then my insurance will take over the claim and see to it that the person I harmed is compensated. However, if I was driving while I was impaired as a result of alcohol or drugs or using a cell phone, either texting or talking, then I can also be held responsible for punitive damages, which are not intended to compensate the victim for the harm I've caused, but instead are intended to deter me and other people who drive while impaired from continuing to do so. Now, the thing that's important about that is that your insurance will not cover punitive damages. You have to find a way to pay that yourself. And it's not a matter of simply filing for bankruptcy and discharging that claim. If you're held liable in punitive damages, you can never get rid of the debt except by paying it off.
Okay. Here is a question, Vicky, let's jump to you. Can someone get a DWI if they took a prescribed drug before driving?
They can. One of the ways you can get a DWI is by being basically just under the influence of a substance, whether that's alcohol or drugs or something like that. And prescription drugs can be something that causes you to be under the influence or impaired by it. There's a few types of prescription drugs where there is an affirmative defense where if you can prove that you were taking it according to your prescription, that can be a defense for you if you are charged with a DWI.
Okay. Here is a question. If a person has completed all the necessary steps to get their license back after their DWI, may that person enter Canada either by train or car? Let's talk about car, because I think that, let's put it this way. If you've had a DWI and you've lost your license, does that affect your ability to go in and out of the country? Does anybody know?
Well, you have to ask the Canadians. I mean, it's their decision.
Okay.
And I know that they won't let people with convictions into their country. Now, whether you can get rid of the conviction by performing all the prescribed steps that our courts have specified, I don't know. I do know that if you can find a way to get the conviction expunged, that might allow you to enter Canada. But you'd have to ask a Canadian attorney or the Canadian federal government that question.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I get that question from time to time because there are a lot of people who are hunters and want to go up to Canada, or we're pretty close to Canada, so a lot of people like to go up there. And basically all I tell them is, we don't get to control what Canada does. I can only control what's in front of me right now.
Sure.
And they have to deal with Canada and their laws, but I don't get any say in how they deal with
You can't write a nice
DWIs.
letter or anything.
Yeah.
Make any calls.
So all I can do is deal with what's in front of me, and they'll have to talk to Canada about the effects of that.
It'd be nice if you had a direct dial to Justin Trudeau, though. That would be very nice.
He's not bad looking either.
No, he's really
so-
not, is he? Nora, I understand it's complicated as far as, you know, how one goes about losing or forfeiting their vehicle, but how do you get your vehicle back once it's been forfeited, or is that possible?
So the forfeiture is pending through the course of the criminal charges. And if there is a conviction at the end, then generally we have a hearing on the forfeiture. And at that time, a judge will decide whether or not to go forward. But in the cases where it's pretty clear if the person who was driving was convicted and is the owner of the car, then the car ends up going forfeit, which means it goes to the possession and the ownership of the government. And then at that point, we have a statute that lays out what we do, but we have to hold a public auction off the car, and then the proceeds go, you know, first to pay off the tow bill, but then next they go against any secured interest, which is, you know, your bank loan for the car, your car loan. So that does generally get paid off, or as much of the money from the auction that there is will go towards that. So people don't end up continuing to owe on cars that they no longer have. But that's it. The car is no longer belongs to the driver.
Can the driver bid for the car at the auction?
That was my question.
You know,
Sorry.
No,
there's
question.
nothing in statute that I've encountered that prohibits that. And so I have people who really want this car for one reason or another, and I say, well, you should follow up with the sheriff's department or whatever municipality police department has the vehicle, because they do the auctioning, and they can give them information on when it might go up for auction.
All right. This question is from a caller. If I lose my license because of a DWI, how do I get it back? Vicky, is that your area?
Sort of.
Kind of.
That's actually a civil side.
Okay.
Different civil side than what we have here. But the Department of Public Safety is the governing body regarding driver's licenses.
Okay.
And so when you get a DWI, there's kind of a wall put up between what the Department of Public Safety does with a driver's license and what we do with your charge.
Okay.
And what we do on the criminal side, we have no say in the driver's license side of things. So if someone does have a DWI, it's always best to contact the Department of Public Safety. They can walk you through how long your license will be suspended, if you can get a work permit, things
Okay.
like that.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you are unfortunate enough to encounter a serious DWI, especially with an injury, you can end up working with somebody on the criminal side, somebody from the Attorney General's office in terms of licensure, me in terms of forfeiture, and Jim in terms of civil liability if you've injured someone.
The lawsuit.
That's a lot of lawyers.
It's a lot of lawyers. It's a good
When-
reason not to do it.
Yeah.
When you see these billboards up, you just blew $10,000. That does not include what I will seek for my clients.
Those are the criminal or the fines that they
And,
get.
and increased auto insurance premiums, as well as all the penalties these two lawyers have just mentioned. So the $10,000 could be a fraction of what it winds up costing, because it doesn't include losing the car. I know a guy who lost a $30,000 vehicle over it, and he had it almost paid off. And he's just lucky he didn't get sued by somebody whom he had hurt or harmed or killed. So.
This is another caller, and I suspect it's the same answer as the previous one, but this is a question about a lost commercial driver's license. I assume that would be the same. And I guess I've heard that that's a little harder to do. Anybody know anything about that?
The people who have a CDL have definitely a higher standard of driving that they have to meet. And again, on the criminal side, we don't have any control over what happens on the licensing side of things. But
Okay.
Well, I can add to that.
Sure.
Typically, a trucking company will not retain a driver who has a DWI conviction. Sometimes they can't keep their job if they get a speeding conviction. So this can mean that they have to get out of the trucking business and go into a different line of work if they get a DWI. And the reason is that the insurance on the trucks, on the trucking line, the insurance premiums will be too high for the trucking line to afford them. They cannot afford to keep a driver who has a drinking conviction. And one of the things that I think needs to be emphasized here is I know all the questions are about drinking, and drinking and driving is the easiest thing to prosecute criminally because it can be detected and proven, with scientific testing. But the same considerations would apply to other forms of impaired driving. Obviously, you can't be charged with drunk driving if you were texting, but you can be charged with reckless driving or careless driving. You can be charged with that if you're on the cell phone and you missed an exit and you run into somebody. So the fact texting or talking on your cell phone when you're supposed to be watching where you're going is not significantly less dangerous to your pocketbook or your liberty or your car than drunk driving is.
We also see at the county attorney's office a number of people who are driving impaired under controlled substances, and
So like prescription medications
or illegal drugs, with some frequency, I would say.
unfortunately, more and more.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
interesting.
And those are people who are identified by law enforcement, driving around erratically or, trying to use the controlled substances while driving, which makes you not drive well on the road, for what the reports I've read. So we're seeing a
More and more of
significant
that.
amount of that too.
Wow. Okay. Well, and this is a somewhat related question, and I want to ask both the county attorneys and then you separately. Let's start with you.
Okay.
Taking medications for Parkinson's, does that make you impaired from a civil liability standpoint, from a negligence standpoint?
It can. If you know or should know that taking any medication, even if it's perfectly legal, even if it's prescribed, if you know or should know that taking that medication might affect your ability to safely operate an automobile, and you take it and then drive, yeah, that's punitive damage territory. And the fact that it might be an affirmative defense to a charge of impaired driving in the criminal area doesn't excuse it in the civil area. You can still be liable to punitive damages.
Okay, so let's go to you, Vicky, then. What would you do with this question? Taking medications for Parkinson's, does that make you impaired?
It depends on what the medication is.
Okay.
Like I said, there's certain medications that qualify for an affirmative defense, and there's some that don't. So it depends on that. And it's true. I mean, the criminal side has a different standard that we have to deal with than the civil side. And so even if maybe there's a chance that we couldn't charge you criminally for something, you could still be liable on a civil side.
Okay.
It sounds like a good conversation to have with your doctor about
Yes,
the medications you're
that's a
taking.
good point. And it doesn't actually say taking prescribed medications, but I'm kind of assuming that, you know. Here's a question from a caller. What does it mean to get a DWI expunged, and how do you do it? Vicky?
Well, an expungement, just in very general terms, is sealing your record so the public can no longer see a conviction. That's a very generalized term for it. Expungements aren't necessarily, I think, what people have in mind. There's still a lot of people who can see a record even after it's been expunged. But it's definitely, if you're interested in looking into an expungement to see if you're eligible for one, it'd be good to talk to a defense attorney.
Okay.
They can tell you if you are eligible to apply for an expungement or not.
I think the volunteer attorney
That's what I was
program
going to say.
also can
Yeah.
help you if you are wondering whether or not you qualify for an expungement.
I think that's true. I think they have a clinic of some sort. Okay. Here's a question from a caller. Involved in accident in 2011 by a drunk driver and still trying to get her deductible back. I'm reading that to mean that the caller was in an accident that was caused by a drunk driver. She had to pay for the deductible on her property damage. What can she do? Dad?
Well, if the injury or if the crash occurred after this date in 2011, and the only problem she has is property damage, that is the damage to her vehicle, then she should go to small claims court tomorrow. If it happened before this date in 2011, she's too late and she should forget about it because she should have sued before now. The statute of limitations on any bodily injury claim in Minnesota is 6 years unless it involves intentional acts, and we won't go into that right now, but 6 years is the max. So she should sue there, and she should be mindful of the fact that if she sues, she has to pay back her own insurer for the collision damage they paid her less the deductible. So if she sues this guy, she should sue for the works, not just her deductible.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Here is a question, maybe for Vicky. It's a doozy.
Does it involve Justin Trudeau, though?
It doesn't. I can make it involve Justin Trudeau.
Word problem for math.
Right? I didn't think the show was about Justin Trudeau.
Well, I didn't either.
Recently.
He's almost as good looking as I am.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this caller recently did get picked up for a DWI. The vehicle was impounded. The individual is handicapped with oxygen and a lot of medications. The test read very high, but the individual has limited lung capacity, and so I assume we're talking about a breathalyzer of some sort. Would the limited lung capacity impact the readings on the breathalyzer? I like this question. It's interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah, it could, but you'd think they would account for that.
I don't know, but it's definitely a factor that's worth looking into. So once someone gets the test result from the breathalyzer, that's definitely a good factor to look into.
Okay, so you wouldn't shut the door on that particular piece of evidence if someone was trying to...
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's still coming from their lungs, but it's definitely worth looking into to see if that would affect it or not. I don't know off the top of my head. I haven't had a case like that
Yeah.
before.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Vicki, but they could also, at the time, they could have requested a blood test. Is that right?
There are other options besides just a breath test. That's right. Most people, the breath test is the easiest one to take. It's the least intrusive. There's also blood and urine test. And if an officer wants to go that route or thinks that's the better route to go, usually a search warrant would be the way to get the blood or urine, just given the intrusive nature of it. But
The individual themselves could have requested that or sought that themselves.
yeah,
also.
if they don't feel like they're capable of giving a breath test, there are other options. But again, that's
Does that happen a lot?
the officer who's dealing with the driver.
Yeah.
They're the ones making the call about what kind of test to
Okay.
take.
Okay.
I need to add something.
I see that.
A contemporary of mine, his wife didn't drink then, one other ex, but she was driving one night and was involved in a crash, and they're all at the hospital, and everybody and the police are there and they're interviewing, and he told his wife, demand a blood test, because he felt she would need to prove that she was sober at the time of the collision so that the lawyers for the other driver, if there was a lawsuit, and there ultimately was one, would not suggest that perhaps she'd been drinking and was able to conceal it from the officers. So she demanded a blood test, and the officers gave her one, and had the staff at the hospital administer it. It proved she was completely, utterly without any alcohol whatsoever in her bloodstream. So I know that in the past, at least, that's the now distant past, that was a long time ago, you could demand a blood test if you wanted one. My law partners may remember the case.
Okay. So in an impaired driving situation, if someone gets pulled over on suspicion of impaired driving, and either the individual requests or one of the responding officers determines that a blood or urine test is appropriate or necessary, does that happen back at the station, or where does, there aren't, okay.
Yeah, that happens after they're done with the roadside test, the field sobriety test, and
Okay.
make that determination that they do think the person is impaired. Then they move on to the next step, which is the implied consent process,
Okay.
which is determining what test to take.
Okay.
To finish up on what she had mentioned about looking into the diminished lung capacity, I'm not pretending I know the answer, because I do not. But if I were that person, I would speak with my doctor for starters and see if my doctor could give me some guidance on whom to consult about the potential of a defense based on diminished lung capacity.
Okay.
That's where I'd start the investigation.
Okay. Nora, here's a question about someone whose spouse was arrested for a DWI, but the family only has one car. What can you tell us about forfeiture in that situation?
So that's an interesting one because the law is actually going to change August 1. Right now, as the law stands, if you have a married couple and one is the driver and one is, not the driver, and they both own the car jointly, they're both registered owners of the car, currently the car can be forfeited, even though one of the spouses is quote-unquote innocent. After August 1st, that car is going to be presumed to remain in the hands of the innocent spouse who wasn't the driver. So that's how the law stands now. Those are the cases that I end up going to trial with when we have innocent owner claims, whether or not it's a mom who sends her kid off to college with the car, or sometimes I have wife when the car is entirely in her name, even though husband drives the car drunk. We get a variety of those cases. And so we have to, in order to forfeit the car, we have to show not only that the person was driving intoxicated, but that the car either belonged to them or they had permission to drive it while drunk.
Wow.
Oh.
Okay. Here's a caller question. If a person is involved in a car accident, car collision, and they were impaired, if the damages exceed the insurance policy, can they come after him personally?
Theoretically, yes. But what this, as a practical matter, it's a waste of time, because unless you're very wealthy, most people don't have assets that are available to satisfy a judgment. That's a complicated statement. It'll have to do for now. The same thing is true of punitive damages. So what this actually does is put an added burden on your automobile liability insurer to settle the claim if they can for an amount that's within the policy limits, the available coverages. The other thing I'll say about this is to avoid the possibility of a judgment for more than what you've got in coverage, get a lot of insurance. I've got 2 or 3 million myself, so I could run amok, I guess.
No, that isn't at all what that means. Okay, all right,
Okay.
good answer. Here's what maybe the last question here, and maybe nobody knows, but what is the term for someone who has committed a crime while in a drunken blackout? Anyone? Is there a special term for that? I think the idea is you lack knowledge or will.
Capacity.
Yes, capacity. So
I had somebody try to use a defense once that they were too drunk to make the decision to flee the police. They lost that argument, and we ended up with their Honda.
So that's not necessarily a defense to anything that we're talking about.
Not for this.
Okay,
Not for drunk
good answer.
Certainly isn't for mine.
All right, that is all the time we have. Please join us next week when we answer your questions about homeowners and auto insurance. I want to thank our panelists this evening and thank you for watching. I'm Stephanie Balmer. Good night.